Hello, my name is Matt, and today I'm going to be showing you how you can share your CMake settings so other people can build your project in the same way you do, with the same variables, with the same settings and everything else. So without further ado, let me just show you what it would look like. I have a project here that is essentially just a skeleton for a calculator. So it's just a UI using IMGUI. And of course, I'm using a package manager, Conan, here to pull all the dependencies that I need for my project, such as OpenGL, FMT, and obviously IMGUI. And this whole project is obviously on Git, so other people can build it if they want to. However, I would have to release some pretty cumbersome build instructions on my project so other people can essentially just copy the way I'm building my project, especially in regards to passing the Conan toolchain file to CMake. People may not be able to guess how to do that without reading your instructions. And this is where CMake presets comes in. So building this particular project is just as easy as doing something like this. So I've just selected a preset to configure, and you can see it's called Debug Ninja, and obviously, as you can guess, it builds in debug. But also interestingly, it defines the CMake toolchain file directory here, the path to the CMake toolchain file in here for me. So it just configured the project, and now building it is just as easy as doing something like this. And that is it. If I look into my build directory, I can see that my executable is created and is located right here. I'm not sure if you guys can see it. And of course I can run the project, meaning that everything was built just fine. All the Conan dependencies were linked in just as expected, and so on and so forth. But now that you can see what CMake presets allows you to do, in other words, make your build and configure stages a lot faster, let's actually talk about what they are. So CMake presets is a newish feature of CMake. I think it was first released in 3.19. that essentially just reads two JSON files, and in these JSON files you can define your configure settings exactly, as well as your build and test settings. And one of these JSON files you can just share to other people in your project directory, and CMake is just going to recognize that. And as you can see here, there are three types of presets. There are configure presets, and the one that most people will likely use. There are build presets and test presets as well. Now each of these preset types will correspond to one of the workflows in CMake. In other words, you can have the CMake configure stage, you can also have the CMake build stage, and also the CMake, C-test stage where you test your project after you've built. So there is a preset for each of those things. So let's take a look at what a preset example may look like. And the CMake documentation website actually does provide that, and I'll post all the links in the description so you can have a look on your own. This is what they provide as one of the examples, and it kind of shows everything that you can do with a preset. So there are some required fields that you need to have in your JSON file, such as the version here, and also the configure presets. I don't think these two are required, but it's also nice to have. You can also define what CMake minimum version you require for your project. But if we take a closer look at the configure presets here, you can see kind of what the layout of this thing looks like. So the configure presets is just an array of different configuration settings, and you can see that each setting is essentially an object in this array. For example, the very first one here, that's called default. In that case, it has the name default, it has the display name default config. It uses the Ninja generator, the binary dir, which essentially just means where your configuration files will get put into after you do a CMake configure, is build/default. And you can see that it uses some macros here, which are supported by CMake. By the way, there are many of these variables that we'll take a look later on in the video that you can also use in your CMake presets. And most importantly, something that is actually really nice to have is that you can define the cache variables for each of your configure settings. So for example, if someone consuming your project is selecting the default configuration preset here, when you do a CMake configure, it automatically is going to define the first cache variable here of a type Boolean, and the value is going to be off. So that's going to get passed into the CMake automatically without the user having to do anything really apart from selecting the preset. And there are a lot more fields that you can define in the configure presets, and it's all very well documented in the CMake documentation. So I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to show you an example. And one thing to keep in mind is that certain features will require certain versions of the CMake presets. For example, if you are creating a CMake preset with version 1, that is available since CMake 3.19. And if I'm not mistaken, version 1 only supports the configure preset. You can't really have a build or a test preset. Those were added on version 3.20 and so on. So each of these parameters that you can include in your JSON file will probably be attached to one of the versions. So just make sure that the version that you're using as your CMake settings schema actually supports that particular property that you want to set. Now let's actually look at my example here. I have already created a CMake presets, as you can probably guess, because I wasn't really going to do it live. It can take some time. But here you can see what we actually achieve with this preset. But the first thing to note is that in my CMake presets.json, I'm using version 2. In other words, I only need CMake 3.20 for this to run. So that's the minimum requirement that I need for my CMake presets because of this version here. And I'm also defining my configure presets, and there's quite a few here which I'll take you through. Well, let's actually, start looking at one of my presets in this case here. So I've got a preset called Debug Ninja, and that inherits from the Conan/dev environment. And I'll explain what inheritance actually means in this case. It's basically what you'd expect. It just gets all the variables and all the settings from a preset that you have previously defined. That's all it does. I have a different display name and the generator definition here. So I'm just using Ninja, as well as a binary dir, which goes under, it should really be something like source directory /build/debug. And of course, I'm also defining a cache variable. And in this case, I'm going to say that the build type of this configuration is debug. And that kind of, is implied by the name of the preset anyway, is a Debug Ninja build. So there are very important things to note here. You do need to have a name in each preset. You do need to have a generator defined in each preset. Either you define it explicitly here or it inherits from a different preset. Either way is fine. You also need to have a binary directory here. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And I think CMake is probably going to complain about that. Now let's look at the inheritance. As you can see, my debug-ninja preset here inherits from the Conan-dev preset. And what that means is that whatever this preset is, Conan-dev here, whatever variables, whatever properties it contains, this preset debug-ninja is going to contain all of that as well. So let's look at Conan-dev. Conan-dev is essentially just a hidden preset. And being a hidden preset just means that whenever I select my preset, you'll be able to see my display names for each preset that I have. However, you can see that Conan-dev doesn't show up here because it's actually a hidden preset here. So it's just meant for other presets to inherit from this. But all this preset does is it defines a cache variable. In other words, it defines my CMake _ toolchain _ file here, and it points to my Conan toolchain file. So this is what makes Conan work in the configuration stage. So that's all inheritance does. Whatever you define in Conan-dev here will be inherited in this Sage Debug Ninja here. And bear in mind, I've not only got this Debug Ninja configure preset that you can see in there, I've also got a Release Ninja configure preset that you can select and configure with. So both of these show up in there in my configure preset. Now, if you've paid attention at the start of the video, I used the command line to do a CMake build, if I'm not mistaken here. So the build preset is exactly for this particular reason here. So when you're doing a CMake build, you can select a preset and it will build in the exact same way as your preset defines. So in this particular file here, if you look at the build presets, you can see that again, it's an array of build presets in the same format as the configure presets. But the properties will obviously be a little bit different because this is equivalent to your CMake build stage. So you can set different things up. Again, you do need to have a unique name, and these names, I'm not sure if you mentioned it before, they all have to be unique. They can't be the same names, otherwise it's probably not going to work. You can also have a display name, which I think is optional. You can have an array of targets. In other words, this build preset is going to tell CMake to only build the targets inside this array. In my case, it's not very interesting because I've only got one target in my project anyway, and it's called IMCalc. You can have things like, the verbosity of the build. So I'm setting verbose to true here. In other words, whenever I do a build, it's going to show me all of the compiler calls that it's making, as well as the flags, because I want to see whether or not it's doing what I expect to be doing. And another mandatory property that you need to have in your build preset is to define a configure preset. So every build preset needs to be attached to one existing configure preset that you've defined in your configure presets here. And as far as I know, this is basically all you need to have in your build presets for it to actually just work. And again, Visual Studio Code has very good support for that. If you do a Control-Shift-P again, you can do a select build preset. And given that you've actually already configured your project using the configure project that this build preset links to here, in Debug Ninja, your build preset should show up here just as you expect it. So let's select that and then try and do a build and see what happens. So let's do a CMake build. So you did the configuration here at the top, and then maybe something changed in the configuration. I don't really know. But when actually building the project down here, you can see that the verbose flag was set because I've got the verbose set to true here. And for other properties, again, I recommend you go into the CMake documentation page and reading all of the CMake build preset properties that you can set in the CMake presets.json file. Now, I'm not going to go over the test presets here, but you can also have the test presets, which again is another array in the CMake presets. And that just corresponds to the ctest call that you'd make after building your project once you want to test your project. So there are properties, unique properties that you can set for that particular stage here. and it just works in the same way. This is what's very nice about presets. Both configure, build, and test presets work in the same way. Now, one thing I wanted to go over before we actually finish this video is that there are two types of presets. There's the CMake presets.json, which, as you can see, is the file that you add to your project's Git repository here. So it's the file that you actually track. And this is what the consumer of your project is going to pull down from your repository, obviously. And it's going to contain all your project-wide configure and build presets, okay? And there's also another file called CMake user presets.json. And this is basically a user-defined file, and it works in the same way as CMake's preset.json. You know, they will look the same thing, except this is what the consumer of your project may be editing on their own if they want to include anything extra to their builds. And the CMake documentation here says that you are encouraged to share this CMake presets.json file, but you're not really encouraged to give a CMake user presets.json, because this is really, you know, something the consumer of your project should be maintaining and modifying as they wish. I really hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial. Essentially, we've looked at how to make your builds, your CMake configure and builds, even easier for people consuming your project as long as you write a CMake presets.json. And if you like this tutorial, please check out my other videos. Specifically, I've got a video which will be up here somewhere about how to debug CMake and C++ projects in Visual Studio Code if you're on WSL. I think that's very interesting if you're using VS Code. And if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe for more content like this. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.